about products that count is that we have speakers who come and share things that they've never shared anywhere else before. So be prepared for some really exciting information. The way I met Ken is several lives ago. Back when enterprise software was like a fast-growing industry, we worked together at Siebel. Ken actually was my boss, I think. And yeah, I remember. And he was great. And then he became an advisor to my company, and then we worked at Facebook together. And so I'm super excited to welcome him. I have to say, I'll share something. The way I realized how incredible Ken was is when he was working at Zynga and he was advising my company. I came to see him and he said, at Zynga we're very data driven. In fact, I just had a presentation with Facebook to tell them how to better manage their data. And to me, Facebook was like the king at managing their data. So the fact that Ken was sort of telling them how to do this and then got hired by them is telling of how amazing he is. Welcome.
Well, thank you. The only reason I was trying to tell Facebook when I was at Zynga what they might be able to do to better manage data is because I really wanted a job there. It worked. So welcome, everyone. Thank you guys for sharing your Tuesday night with Yelp and with me. And I hope the presentation is 10% as good as the pizza. So my name is Ken Rudin, and I've been at Facebook for several years now, about 3.5 years. And what we've really focused on during that time is how to, as best we can, transform Facebook from a company that had a lot of data to a company that was very data-driven. We had tons of data years ago, but we didn't have an analytics organization. We had analysts that were scattered throughout the organization, kind of doing their own thing. It was a bit of a Wild West culture, and it kind of came to a head when we started talking about going public as a company, and figured it would probably be a good idea to get a handle on how many users we had. And depending on who you asked, you got numbers that could vary by well over 5 or 10%, which is many tens of millions of people. And it's really hard to misplace tens of millions of people. So we figured we had to do something. And so my charter has been to figure out what we can do to become a world-class kind of leading organization in terms of what data we use and how we use it. So we made a lot of mistakes along the way. We've learned a couple lessons. And so what I want to share here is a bunch of the lessons that we learned. And part of this, too, is there are several commonly held beliefs, you can call them myths if you want, about what you should be doing with data and data management and analysis and so on. And kind of along the way, I learned that a lot of these were tripping me up, and they just weren't true. So I'll share what I consider a couple myths that people still generally talk about, but I no longer believe. And feel free to challenge them as well. But I think that has helped us quite a bit, too, to just try and rethink a lot of this. So in terms of when we talk about analytics, I like to frame it in this kind of a holistic view. And there's 4 things that I really talk about. Most of the time when somebody wants to chat about analytics with me, it's usually about, tell me about the technology. And yeah, technology is really important. It does act as the foundation for all of this, but it's only one of many other pieces. The second piece, going clockwise here, is fairly obvious. It's the analysis part, which is, so what are you actually doing with all that technology? And truth be told, I'd much rather have people who know how to ask good questions, and we'll get into this, on terrible technology than world's best technology, but people who don't really understand what analytics can truly be used for. The challenge, though, with just stopping at analysis, which is where most people would stop, they kind of draw a line here and that would be it, is the impact of analysis doesn't end with the analysts and whatever they output. The impact of an analyst is really focused on a couple things like culture and org structure. And those were things that I had left out initially and came back to bite me, but along the way we figured out that those are equally as important as any of the other items on this slide. So I'll be covering all of these. To start with the foundation, technology definitely is the underlying substrate for everything you want to do. And as a big data company, we fell into the trap that big data equals Hadoop. And Facebook is young enough that we started with Hadoop at the core of our systems. Bigger companies that have a lot of data tend to have started in the relational world a long time ago. And they were all kind of scrambling towards, well, Hadoop is this great new thing, and it's highly, highly scalable, and it can do some magical things, and it truly can. But they're all moving towards Hadoop. We thought we would outsmart everybody and just start with Hadoop and leave everything else behind. But we found a couple interesting things, that we were really focusing on the technology itself. And really what ends up happening is big data isn't about technology. And we learned this over a period of a year or so. It's really not about technology. It's about focusing on what it was we were trying to do. So why did we want big data? I'm not sure we'd ever really asked ourselves that question. We had it, but we weren't exactly sure. We weren't able to describe why we wanted it. And so it kind of came down to a couple different buckets that we put things in, where we said, okay, we want some big data technology to solve these problems. And one was we needed to do deeper analysis. So we needed more data so we could do the deeper analysis. We also wanted to do different kinds of analyses that SQL itself wasn't very good at. If you want to walk a social graph, for example, it's really hard to do that. Yes, you can do it, but it's cumbersome to do that with traditional technologies. And also we were having this issue that things were changing really quickly. And when you talk about something like a relational model, you have to define this schema up front. You have to define everything you want to do up front and then build on top of that, which certainly has its advantages. But the downside is anytime you want to change something, you have to go back and change kind of the blueprint for it first. And many times we didn't really know what we wanted to do with the data. So we wanted something where we could kind of dump the data somewhere and then figure it out later. But when you start thinking about all the different use cases that you can use big data for, and you start focusing on the business problems and a lot less on what technology you're going to use, it turns out that you get to open yourself up to using a lot more technologies, a lot broader range of technologies than just something like Hadoop or things that are traditionally categorized as big data. So we ended up finding that in a lot of cases, we were using the wrong tool. We were trying to use Hadoop for everything. And it's very, very scalable, but it's not very fast, and it doesn't do a lot of things that other technologies are really good at. And so if we wanted to do analysis of various users of our system by the products that they were using, and the interfaces, whether it was on Android or iOS or on a web browser, that is a very SQL-like question. I want to look at number of users by some interface or by some geography, or the people who registered this week by the native language that they speak, because we are rolling out some 32 new languages and wanted to find out how these languages were being adopted and did we do a good job and did we have to go back and fix some of those translations. So from that we said, you know what, we're trying to use Hadoop for this. This is exactly what SQL was designed for. So let's bring relational back into the picture. And then we found ourselves in this kind of odd situation where most of the world was going from relational and trying to turn it off and go to Hadoop. We had Hadoop to do big data better. We had Hadoop, and we're trying to expand that into relational so we could do big data better. And then we found that we needed some real-time systems and some in-memory systems and some systems that that were more focused on the document structure of things versus a row and column structure of things. So we ended up using a lot of different technologies. And ultimately what we found was that we'd probably wasted a fair bit of time trying to get Hadoop to do all of these things when just some traditional, we use MySQL a lot now everywhere. So once we open ourselves up to that, then we could really just figure out what's the best technology we want to use for what we're trying to do. And just as an example of like when we use these various technologies, when we look at just the two here that I started talking about with the Hadoop and relational. So in our world, all of the data that we collect from users who are sharing the data does go into our Hadoop system. Currently, it's the only system we know of that can handle that volume of data, which is in the many hundreds of petabytes at this point. So we will start with trying to figure out what are the metrics that really matter. Well, the only place we can really figure that out is where all the data is. So we will do that in Hadoop. But once we figure that out, then we really want to go to an environment that is much more amenable to doing iterative analysis and much more responsive. You know, Hadoop tends to be more batch mode. So then we'll move that into a SQL system. So once we want to operationalize a metric that we figured out this is something we want to keep track of, we want to look at it every day, we want to monitor this, that's when we move into relational. So the type of analysis we're doing, if it's discovering things, that tends to be Hadoop. If it's doing operational analysis on something we already know is important, we'll do that in relational. When we talk about the granularity of the data itself, if you really need to go look at, you want to define a new cohort of users that is very specific and has certain qualities, certain attributes, well, you won't really have that in a relational system because relational can't hold that amount of data. So we will do that in Hadoop. But once we understand whatever it is we want to about that particular user and figure out, again, what are the important parts, we can then aggregate that and summarize it. We don't need the raw data anymore. And we can put that into a relational system because it's much easier and much faster to do that in relational. And the types of questions we tend to ask, and most people do tend to ask, are the types of questions that relational was designed to answer. They just can't do it on big volumes of data yet. And maybe they won't ever be able to. But we can aggregate it down quite a bit, and then it enormously speeds up our analysis. And then we will look at things like time frames. Since all the data is flowing into Hadoop initially, if we want to do monitoring, that comes out of Hadoop. But if we want to look at changes week over week, month over month, year over year, way, way too slow to do it in something like that. We'll use relational for that. And I could have equivalent charts for when we use real-time systems and in-memory systems and so on. But just going through this process made everybody a hell of a lot happier. So that's the summary of kind of what we learned about technology. I want to start getting into what we do about analysis. And this gets a lot more philosophical in terms of the lessons we learned and the culture that we tried to create. And this is where I think myth number 2 comes up, which is the notion that big data gives you better answers. If you've got more data, then you can get better answers. And I think at the face of it, that again may be a true statement, but it's not really the important statement. What you want to think about is that if somebody is coming up with brilliant answers to questions that nobody cares about, you're adding no value. You've got to be focusing on what the value is. So the main thing for us was not all of this data, we can do all of these analyses. Because the problem with that is you end up doing all of these analyses. There's so much data and so much computing power at your fingertips, you will just end up kind of getting lost. You lose the forest for the trees. You get lost in all the data. You can ask an infinite number of questions on all of that data, and it's not really clear if the answers to any of it are meaningful. So really what we started realizing was that it's not all about a science. I guess another way I could have phrased this myth is that data science is a science. I don't think that's exactly true either. I think data science is as much an art as it is a science. And I think one of the skills that is in the least easy to find skill for a data scientist is business savvy. Not do they know the latest algorithms and how good are they at statistics. So this factors into a couple of mistakes we made and how we learned from that. But it's not about getting the right answer. Technology really helps you with that. I'd say 10, 15 years ago, as an analyst, having the ability to write SQL and get the answers is how I kept my job. But now technology does all of this, and so many people know how to do that. The value of an analyst is not how to work the technology. The best analysts are the ones who know it's no longer enough to come up with the right answers. You have to come up with the right questions. And that's hard. There aren't any real good tools that help us do that yet. And maybe there will be, maybe there won't, I don't know. But I always talk about the battle between silicon versus carbon. And the silicon is the science part. That's the computing power. That can get us an answer really, really quickly. But if it's the wrong question, all I've done is gotten the wrong answer a lot faster. So it's still the carbon, which is our brains, that helps us really focus where the most value is going to come from. So the problem is, okay, if this is more of an art, what can we do to help us focus on getting the right questions? And we came up with a few different things. One was we changed the profile of the people we were trying to hire. We used to look at people who had the typical academic background of what you would consider a data scientist or an analyst. So they were really good in the technologies, and they had a lot of statistics backgrounds. Many of them had PhDs and so on. But this is when we started running into the issues I mentioned before of them coming up with these brilliant answers to questions that we weren't really going to act on. And I can use an example from a prior company where this was Zynga, and where I first kind of noticed this, and not sure I did anything about it right then and there, because it didn't really strike me as a real problem. But when I noticed it a second time, then I realized there was something going on here. We had a data scientist who had looked at all the various games that Zynga was publishing and was looking at them and applying portfolio theory to this, which, without getting into any of the details, it was simply, if you have games, they will increase in adoption, and then they'll plateau for a while, and then over time, at some point, they all eventually fade. And so the notion was, when is the best time to introduce your next game? Because if the other game is just on the up part of the curve, you don't necessarily want to introduce a new second game, which could theoretically compete for users and cannibalize each other. So the optimal time would be to figure out right when it's cresting and starting to come down, you want to launch a new game to pick up the users who are coming off the old game, and so on. And that was the general gist of it, and had lots and lots of really complicated math to figure out how do you know when something is cresting and starting to come down. And then the notion was we now have an optimal time to launch the next game. Does anybody have can anybody see any problems with this type of analysis? I don't know if I want to have everybody raise their hands, but you can think about it. So the problem with that was nobody's going to ever actually act on this, because think about it. You're a game studio, and which is what we call the different divisions. You're a game studio, and you're working on this game. And there's kind of two scenarios where the algorithm tells you now's the time to launch, and either, aside from the really unique case where it's exactly the time you're ready to launch, it's either going to be before you're ready to launch or after you're ready to launch. So if it's before you're ready to launch, you're like, hey, now's the time to launch. It's the best time. You can't launch. You're not ready. It's not done. What about the other extreme of, hey, guys, I know you're done, but you really need to wait a couple months because the other game is still doing well and we don't want to release this one yet. Now you just have 100 developers sitting around, and what are they going to do? They can keep developing more and more of the game, but the problem is they need to get it out into the real world so they can start getting feedback about what people like. Otherwise, they'll spend another 6 months refining and refining this game without ever getting any actual feedback from users as to what they should be refining. So in either of those scenarios, nobody's going to pay attention. When are they going to release the game? When it's ready. That's it. So no algorithm is going to change that. So asking the question of what is the optimal time is kind of a meaningless question when you take a step back and think about, so how does the process of releasing games really work? It won't apply. So that was a pretty big wasted effort. So that's the notion where you have to have business savvy. And so what do we do now? We look for people who have operational experience. We look for people who have business experience. We look for entrepreneurs. And one tactical thing we do, which I'd recommend you all do as well, traditionally when we were focusing on just the PhDs in statistics and so on, we would ask some questions like, okay, here's a data set. Here's the metric that we're looking for. How would you calculate that? Either what's the SQL to do it or what's the formula you would use. Now what we do before we get to that question is, here's a business problem. Retention is increasing here but decreasing over there. Tell me what metrics you think would be important to look at in the first place. Then after that, you can have a discussion on that. Then it's all right, now that you've kind of thought about what metrics were important and why you think they're important, then you can actually focus on how would you actually make sure that you can calculate those metrics. So now we have half of our interview is more on, we call it product sense, and then the other half of it is on the analytic sense. And another question we'll ask is, what's your favorite app on your phone? And give me 3 or 4 things you would do to that to improve it, and how would you know that it's actually improved? What would you measure to see if it's improving? So those are the kind of questions we look for because they can add a lot more value to the business. Second thing we learned was about training everyone. We have something at Facebook that we call Data Camp, which is a 2-week immersive intensive program for new analysts. And what we do there is you come in for 2 weeks, and it's effectively as if you haven't really started the company. Your manager isn't supposed to bug you at that point, or you're not supposed to be invited to meetings, you're not checking email. You're there to learn for 2 weeks, and it's early morning to late at night for 2 solid weeks. And we walk you through basically how to best use Facebook's tools, what kind of data we have. That's the first week. The second week is, and then how to frame questions in a way that is meaningful to the business. So we go through the hard skills and then the soft skills. And that worked pretty well. It's a pretty popular program. But we started getting a couple requests from product managers, could they attend this too? And then engineers wanted to attend it too. And then we kind of realized that this is actually working out really, really well. And now at this point, most new employees, even people who are in product design, people who are in finance, people who are in marketing, go through this class, or some, we have a few different versions of it, but it's all essentially the same thing. The notion is not we want everyone to be an analyst. That's really not going to happen in 2 weeks. But what we do want to do, and this is really important for a data-driven culture, we want to make sure everyone understands what data can do and how to ask questions in such a way that they can be answered by analysts and answered with the data. So the goal of it is really 2 weeks to get a really strong appreciation about how data can help pretty much any role you're working in the company and how to use it effectively. So that's really created, that was a pretty big cultural moment for the company, because the only thing we had had historically was something that we called boot camp, which was a real culture builder, but it was only for engineers, where they go through the entire Facebook technology stack. So boot camp still is for engineers, but now we have data camp, which is for most people in the company. And if you can do something like that, where you get everybody in the company familiar with what being data-driven really means and how to do it, yeah, they do get a little exposure to the tools, but we don't expect that any of them will be experts at it. It really helps build the data-driven culture more than kind of anything else we did. And then the third thing we did was change what it was that we valued or evaluated ourselves on. A long time ago, what we did in the analytics space, and I've been in the space a couple of decades now, it was really focused on reporting. And this is if you knew how to write SQL, you could get a job, because you could pull data and tell people what happened. And then, of course, we got to insights. And, hey, it's more important to not just tell me what happened, but tell me a little bit why it happened. And there's even kind of a spot beyond uncovering insights, which is, I'm sure everybody's heard the term, actionable insights. And that's kind of where we are today as an industry, that the focus should be on actionable insights, which is don't just tell me why it's happening, tell me what I should be doing about it. But the problem with stopping at actionable insights is you haven't completed the last mile. If you come up with what people should do, and they don't actually do it, that means nothing changes. And if nothing changes, you've added no value. So you have to be focused on what was the impact of what you did. And that's kind of hard for a lot of analysts to sign up for, because they're thinking, hey, I don't actually control the engineering team or the product management team, and I may have a really interesting insight that I do think is going to be extremely valuable and does make a lot of business sense, but if they don't do it, that's not my fault. I don't have control over that. So I should get credit for the brilliance of the insight itself, not these other things that I don't have control over. The problem is I don't think it's a correct statement to say you don't have control over it. Well, maybe that's a correct statement, but I don't think it's a correct statement to say you have no control whatsoever. You have a ton of influence over that. And the analogy I'll use is if you're a sales rep, that argument reminded me of a sales rep saying, hey, I went to a whole bunch of clients. I gave great presentations, really gave them great proposals. It's really not my fault that they didn't buy because I can't force them to buy. So the fact that I didn't make quota, you can't blame me. And what would you say to that sales rep? You're like, well, look, obviously you picked the wrong customers to talk to. You didn't understand exactly what their issues were. Yes, you cannot force them to buy, but you can greatly influence that. And the same is true for analysis. If you need to understand what the business issues are that are facing the company or facing the product team that you're part of. And you'll see that that flowed into a couple other changes that we made along the way. But if you understand what the main goals are of the team that you're working with, then your job is to figure out, well, how can data help that team hit that goal? So if you come up with something that says, hey, I figured out a way to reduce churn by 5%, but what they're really focusing on is how do they expand in India. It is a good analysis, but it's not going to get acted on because it's not what they're focused on. So you should figure out, well, what can I learn from the data about languages and locales and what goes on in India and what's been happening in the past to help influence the product direction so that we can get more registrations in India. That is much, much more likely to get adopted because it's aligned with what they want to do. So you really do have a lot of influence in terms of whether you can drive impact or not. So we really focus on the notion that you have to focus on impact, not insight. Because insight is a step along the way. But again, I've said this twice before, and I'll probably say it 2 more times. If nothing changes, you have added no value. And just the logical thought process there is, if nothing changes, then what would be different if you weren't even working at the company? Nothing changed. So you could have not been there, we could have saved your salary, and the outcome would have been exactly the same. So that's a little bit of a harsh statement, but it is the way to get people to realize that. I mean, I think it's hard to argue that statement, though. But it's the right way to get people to realize that you have to sign up for making an impact. Like, we are going to increase registrations in India by 2%, and here's how we're going to do it using data versus, what some other approach to another organization could have done. But this is what we're going to focus on. One thing you do have to do here is, if you're talking about impact, you have to define what you mean by impact. And it's not really easy to define, and it's not always measurable. And as analysts, or maybe it is always measurable, but I haven't figured out how to measure it in a lot of cases. But as analysts, that's really frustrating because you really want to measure things. But we have figured out a way to kind of categorize it. That what we mean by you have to have an impact is almost always it falls into one or more, generally more than one, of these buckets. You need to move a metric. So registrations have to go up by X%. You need to change a product and be able to point to it saying that feature is in the product because of an analysis we did. If you guys have used Facebook, then you're familiar with the people you may know feature, which was introduced a long time ago. That came from analysis that said, it's really interesting that if Ken knows John and John knows Sophie Charlotte, then Ken probably knows Sophie Charlotte. And they came up with a really fancy name for that. And it wasn't just solely people at Facebook, but they call it triangle closure because Ken is point A and Sophie Charlotte is point B, and I can't remember the names I used, but call them A, B, and C, right? If A knows B and B knows C, then A knows C, so you just close the triangle. And they did a lot of analysis saying that in most cases, if they look at people who already were friends, that these relationships were true. So why don't we start looking for a bunch of places where I know Joe and Joe knows Frank, and I know Bill and Bill also knows Frank, and I know Sally and Sally also knows Frank. If I can get a few of those, it's very likely I know Frank. So why don't we recommend that Ken become friends with Frank, and that's where the people you may know feature came from, directly driven by analytics. And then the last one is change a behavior or a process, either for you internally or externally. And we found a whole bunch of ways that we could change our revenue forecasting model. There's a lot of cyclicality in our business and lots of things that affect it. And we were able to do some analysis and build much more accurate models than we had built in the past to do a much better job of predicting our revenue. So these are generally the types of things when you're talking about it. If you can't measure it, you better at least be able to point to it and say, that was what we did. And that's a big cultural thing, that it's not, I don't really care so much about the insights, and I really don't care about how complicated it is. If you were able to move metrics with some very simple insights And by all means, please do so, and you get full credit for that. Other things. Now, org structure turns out to be really critically important based on some of the things that I'd said in the past. And most notably, you want to be able to understand what is going on, what the priorities of the product team are. So typically, there are two scenarios that you find in companies. Scenario one is where you have the analysts as a separate group, and it's centralized. And then you have these business teams that are separate from that. And the analysts in this case are service providers, where the business units will come to them and say, I need this data, I need this dashboard, I need these reports. And you can usually tell when you're in this type of model because the goals for the analyst team tend to be around service levels and how quickly can I answer the questions and how accurately can I answer your questions. And the problem with that is this is a very, very reactive model. And you really, I mean, it's not quite this bad, but it's like you're sitting there waiting for them to come in, then they have a question, and your job is how quickly can I get them the answer? So, to my mind, what value you really add there is you're saving time. Now, it's good to save time, but that is a tiny amount of the value you should be adding as an analyst, which is what is really driving this company and how can we do more of it? The reason I think of it predominantly as saving time is because at this point, most people can write their own SQL queries, and they could do it if you weren't around. It would just take them longer, and they probably wouldn't get it right the first few times. But you're a specialist at it, so they just hand it to you because you'll get it done faster. So there is a little bit of value in that, but not nearly as much as you should have. The other model, and this is kind of how Facebook started, was that you have a very decentralized model where you've got these product teams that grow up and they decide, oh, we need somebody to look at the data, and they hire their own analysts. The problem with that is, and this is, as I was mentioning, it was very hard for us to figure out how many users we had because it depended on who we asked. And there were things like, okay, if somebody's using Instagram and Instagram can connect to Facebook so you can post a picture on Instagram and Facebook, if you take a photo on Instagram and through Instagram post it to Facebook, are you a Facebook user that day or not? There's no right answer, but you better be consistent about how you answer that question. And we clearly weren't. So you get inconsistencies, that's kind of one bad thing and fairly obvious. The one that I think is more dangerous and less obvious is redundancy. Everybody realizes within these organizations that there are a certain set of problems that they're trying to address. And because they want to be proactive and they're all type A people, they figure out, I'm going to build a solution to that. I'm going to automate this process. I'm going to come up with a way to standardize all of this. The problem is each group does that independently. So A, you're wasting a huge amount of effort. And B, is coming up with redundant solutions. And B, it's not even quite correct to call them redundant because they're completely incompatible with each other as well. And then you have to spend an equally long time trying to unwind the problems you just created. So what do? You don't want to be centralized, you don't want to be decentralized. And we went through both of these models, and then we came up with basically a mashup of both of them. And we call it the embedded model. So essentially what it means is that the analysts do report into a central organization. They do all, ultimately roll up into my team. They just don't sit with me. We all used to sit in one big area and we could share information. That was great. But they don't sit with me. They sit with all the product teams. And so that way they can be part of all the conversations. When they all sat with me, one of the things that we all noticed was the product teams would build a product. And then when it was launched, then they would get us involved to kind of track how it's doing and figure out what's working and what's not. Now what happens, and what we wanted to happen, so that we could really have more impact and be more proactive, is we're part of the team, we sit with the team, and when they're talking about, all right, we're going to create this new product or we're going to come up with a new version, whereas 3 years ago it used to be the product team of engineers, PMs, and designers getting around a table to figure out where we go next. Now it's engineers, PMs, designers, and analysts helping to figure out what's going on. And the charter for the analysts is to bring their perspective that's different from the other three. The PM will bring the perspective of where we should go from what the market's doing. And the engineers will bring their perspective of where to go based on technology. And the designers will bring their perspective based on what's going on in the world of design that we can make this easier to use and more engaging. And the analyst has to bring the perspective of, and what is the data telling us about where this product is performing and where it needs work? That's what you have to bring to the table. So this enables that. If you're going to focus people and evaluate people on impact, you've got to set it up so that they're able to understand where they can have the most impact. Being a purely centralized team, you can't do that. Being decentralized, you can do that, but then you run into all those redundancy problems. So now what we do is, because it all rolls up to one place, we can enforce standards, we can have standard processes around and definitions of metrics and how we want to structure the data. And we've got one set of infrastructure for everybody, but they're physically they're embedded with the product teams, so they can get as close as possible and really physically be part of those teams. So this is just a quick summary of those points. You now get the benefits of each. The downside is, and there is a downside to this, which is you get a lot of the benefits of each of the areas, but it becomes harder to maintain a centralized culture. You still have the issue of a decentralized team, so that since they don't all sit with each other, information sharing is harder. So you have to be more explicit about it, and it's just fundamentally harder. So you will find that occasionally the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and that can be bad, but it's dramatically less often than it used to be when they were physically separate orgs. So this is where we've ended up, and we've been doing that for a few years now, and it works pretty well for us. Question?
Do you have a product manager for
Do we have a product manager for the infrastructure? Essentially, yes. Is that the question? Oh, that was an easy one. Okay. 7 times 6 is 42.
How long do the analysts stay in this unit? Do they rotate?
Yeah, how long do analysts stay embedded within a business unit? We don't have any hard and fast rules. We have guidelines. So what we like to do is we do want them to rotate, because there's a benefit to, that's one of the ways we keep a consistent culture instead of them becoming kind of balkanized and devolving back into kind of the chaotic state where it was a few years ago. But the guideline we do have is we like you to stay at least a year in that place, because it takes a few months to ramp up on what that product team is doing and really learn the product well and start to add value. And we kind of figure that if you move every 3 months, by the time you ramp up, you've gone, so that doesn't help the product team. You really can add some significant value within a year. So we ask people that unless there's some extenuating circumstance, try to stay for at least a year. And there are other people who have been in product teams for well over 2 years and 3 years, and that's when we're starting to encourage them to move, but some of them just love it. So we don't have any requirements, but we do try to encourage that people circulate and to share knowledge. And, if you go from one of our product groups to another, you can bring the perspective of one to the other. There was one other question over there.
You go about doing
Yeah, no, I do get asked that question occasionally, and I would start this way, where it's fairly simple. In a small company, all I would say is, look, have an analytics leader and an analytics team, but just make sure that the analysts sit with, if you're a financial analyst, please sit right next to the guys in finance. And if you're working on product X, please sit right next to them. Don't sit together, which is how it normally, this is the analytics area. They should be wherever they are. And that even goes for remote offices. So most of our analysts are in the Bay Area here, but we have a couple products. We have this concept of the center of gravity of a product, which is where is the heart of the product really being built. And so we have a couple products that are really being built in Seattle and a couple that are really being built in London. And so in those scenarios, we will ship or hire analysts to be in Seattle and to be in London, because that's where they can really be part of the team. You want them to be where the center of gravity is. So the last part, and this is kind of, I mentioned I would say it at least twice more. This is, I don't know if I said it once more already, but this is the last time you'll hear it for now. This is the bottom line. So this is really how I want to summarize everything, which is you as analysts or the analysts in your company have to have a cultural mindset of we need to make things change. You should be able to point to what has changed because of the fact that this team exists and because of the work you did. If you can't do that, then you're just doing research. And there is a spot for research, just not in most companies that we work for. Academic institutions and so on do great research, and that's a great spot for that. But you have to be able to think about how is this going to change? And also, when somebody then does come to you, so we try and be a very proactive organization and drive our own roadmaps and then work with the product teams to say, this is what we're planning on doing this quarter, and here's why. And then they'll give us feedback, and we'll change things and so on. But we're starting the conversation as much as possible, rather than them saying, here's what we need from you this quarter, and it's a list of tasks. So you really have to focus on what's the impact that you're going to make and figure out what things are we going to own. And as I say at the top, own the outcome. And the people who do this well are really changing how analytics is perceived in a company. Going from a team of service providers to a team of real leaders. I don't mean managers, I mean leaders, where they're thought leaders and product leaders. And I think as an analyst, that kind of transition is the most fun you can have. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Okay, 10 minutes for questions. Yes, question. Okay, so the question is, what's the biggest obstacle to put some of these things into practice? And for us, and I think in general this tends to be true, the biggest obstacle is changing the mindset of the rest of the company that you're not service providers. Because they want to come to you and say, I need this report. Where's this report? I need this data set. Please do it. Please do it. And they just want to give you a list of tasks. And it has nothing to do out of being malicious. They've been trained that that's what your role is. And it's worked for them in the past. So the hardest part is to say, no, we're going to be doing some things proactive, which means we will occasionally push back on what you're suggesting. But even if it doesn't involve that, we're going to be doing some things that you didn't really ask us for, and they'll start freaking out saying, well, that's going to take up time, and I may want you to do other things, and you can run into some conflict there. The way that works best is figure out a way to add value to the team in something that's reasonably small, that wasn't something that they had thought of. Because that, and I can give you a specific example of something we did a while back. The reason is because that can help them then realize, oh, wait a minute, these guys have good ideas, and they can add more value than just waiting for me to ask them to do something. And the quick example was, I've used India a lot, but a while ago, we had registration on our website for people in India, and the registration was, the page came up in English. And we kind of noticed that after people register, you can change your locale in Facebook to say what language you would prefer. And that there was an enormous percentage of people who were changing their language in India. And so two things. First of all, a lot of those languages at the time we didn't support. And second of all, those languages were aligned with the locales that they had chosen on their cell phones or on their laptops. So, Windows was already running in that locale, or their Android or iOS was already set to that locale, and we had access to that information. So we went to them and said, look, if you want to increase registration, one of the things to do is present the registration page in their native language without even requiring them to select it. Yes, you could select it at the bottom, but nobody even saw that. And so we would just read the locale from whatever device they were on and present the registration page in that. And so that was an idea we had come up with just by looking at how many people end up changing their languages. And you can see a step change in registrations based on that. And a step change in the retention afterwards as well. So then they're like, oh, that was actually a pretty good idea, and got any others. And it wasn't quite that simple, but keep doing that, and then you start to prove. So you have to earn it. And it's not easy, because there's always a list far longer than you can do in 24 hours a day. So you have to figure out how to push some of that aside and carve out and do something that is proactive to show them that you can add a lot more value. Other questions?
So some sorts of like various analysis algorithms could be exceedingly expensive. But when would you go? Is there a time something big?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So we could try one more time, and if not, I'll answer it offline.
I mean, so is there a time when like data from something that's big causes you to look more intensively at something small that would cause you to invest?
Oh yeah, I mean definitely. Like there are cases where we have looked at, what's the optimal way to price ads, because we have a marketplace and they get a price. Now, the most popular analytical tool for figuring out how to do something is A/B testing, right? Where you try two versions and see which one works. You can't do A/B testing on ad prices because you can't say, oh, you want to place this ad, it costs you $1, and this other company, we randomly selected you, you get to pay $2. So we can't do it. So we looked at, well, there are some leading indicators of how well an ad is going to perform based on pricing. But then we did a lot of research on how do we really model that well? How can we build a model that can kind of model the Facebook ecosystem so that we can then plug in different ad prices and see what the expected outcome will be. So that took a lot of computing resources and a lot of very smart people to figure out how you define the Facebook economy as a bunch of formulas that you can then plug values into and see how it will run over time and, let it iterate and so on. So that was a pretty cool, thing with there was a machine learning in there and so on. That was a pretty deep research project, but it was for a specific purpose. We don't want to do the research projects like we had done years ago, which is, so how connected is the world? You've heard of the 6 degrees of separation, and is that really true? Can you connect anybody to anybody else through no more than 6 hops? It turns out it's fewer than 6, but so what? I mean, how does that help Facebook? And it certainly doesn't help that Kevin Costner game, if you know what I'm referring to. Sorry, Kevin Bacon. Ooh. Yeah, Kevin Costner wouldn't work. Sorry. All right. Anyway, so I hope I answered it. Okay. Other questions? Yes. What are the biggest challenges we face with unstructured data? I think the biggest challenge is how much of it to store, and then how much of it are we going to analyze. So the unstructured data takes massively more compute power to analyze because it's not in a nice, neat format. And the main things we want to learn are, what's trending has become very popular. And then another thing that we do is try and identify for companies what the sentiment, what people are saying about their companies. And so we can only do that, first of all, on publicly posted things. Anything you post to your friends is off limits, so we don't do any analysis on that. But some of these posts can be super, super long, and trying to figure out, do you actually want to do analysis on that? It's essentially equivalently hard to figure out which of the several billion posts a day do we want to sample it down to, and how do we figure out what's a meaningful sample that is still representative of the overall data set? Because there's no way we have the compute power to analyze all of it. So this is, again, kind of a researchy project of when it's just text, it's really hard to figure out what's a meaningful subset of it that you can do analysis on and still get roughly the right answer. So I would say the short answer to the question is figuring out how to sample it so that we can still get useful results. Let me take maybe 2 more questions. Okay, yes. Yeah, okay, so the question is, a lot of times you can think up the right question, but you don't have the data to answer it. And so how often, in terms of being proactive, will we go out and actually, we refer to that as logging the data, how often will we go out and actually change the logging? And in our case, I would say about 20% of the time we'll go in, and some of our analysts certainly have the skills to do that, and they'll go in and add the logging. But the other 80% of the time, our job really is to work with the engineers and convince them to do it. And the culture we try and put in place there is, what you want to avoid is, I'm like, oh, logging, I hate doing logging. It's like commenting my code. You know, I hate doing that. It doesn't really serve a purpose. And hope I didn't offend any engineers. But the notion is, if you're missing logging, then it is not functionally complete. You treat it as a bug. If you're not logging the data that's needed, then that needs to be treated as a bug. So we will go in and do it when we can, but often it's pretty hard for us to decipher what's already there. So then we will work with I try and stay out of the business of doing the logging ourselves, but definitely getting into the business of saying, you need to log this, and because this is going to be really valuable for these following reasons, so you need to start doing that. Take one more question. So, yes, over there.
So how do you think about what's the right stat? A number of products, a number of goods, complexity?
You know, so how do we figure out how many analysts that we should be hiring? And there's a theoretical answer and a practical answer. The practical answer is it's more than we are able to hire because there's just such a shortage of analysts. So we're nowhere near where we'd like to be. But what we try and do is figure out, we come up with ratios that seem to work for us, and we do it different based on the different stages of a product. So earlier products, you need fewer analysts because there's less history, there are fewer things to maintain, there's less history, and there's less going on with that product. Then when it kind of hits midlife is when you need the most analysts, because not only do you have to maintain things that were built earlier, but you're also building more and more stuff. And then that ratio drops back down when you're kind of somewhat sunsetting a product or you feel like you've gotten most out of it. Then it goes much more into maintenance mode, and you try and move those analysts onto areas where they feel that they can have a bigger impact. So when we talk about the ratio of the ratios that we feel are most important in our scenarios is analysts to product managers. And we are about 1.5 product managers to every analyst. And then we also have analysts to data engineers, which are the people who build infrastructure. And there we're about 2 analysts to every 1 data engineer. So those are very, very rough. I mean, that's if I average it over the whole company. But in some cases, we'll be 4 to 1. In other cases, we're 1 to 1. But average over the company, if I just want to set budgeting, you know, those are the rough numbers that I at least start with, and then I'll iterate up and down when we do planning on an annual basis.
Ken, thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you all.